Okay, welcome back to the Shared Practices podcast. This is the final pre-ownership flashback before season 4. We have one of our all-time favorite guests coming back on, but first, welcome back, George. How are you?
Good. I took a couple weeks there. Nobody heard from me, so everyone was happy, and now I'm back. So here I
No,
am.
I miss you. I realized that recording intros and outros like by yourself is like just not as fun. Like it's just kind of like okay. I it's not the same. I'm glad we're back on an episode together.
Yeah, both of our schedules have changed quite a bit. You starting your more long term stay in the army and Fort Still, and me in ownership. I don't think we've gotten like a flow yet where we can make these work easily. So I'm happy
No,
to be back on.
we haven't, and so we're finally connecting. So tell me about this episode, and how you got Dr. Leune back on the show.
So first of all, huge thanks to Scott Leune for coming on again. He's been on our show before. Great guy, and I think for most people when they hear him, he's incredibly intelligent and very data driven. Those are two things that really appeal to me about him. And he's always talked about startups, or not always, but that's what people tend to associate him with.
Sure.
And I, in my acquisition, have realized the benefit of outsourcing some services because it's an easy way to implement change without disrupting your team. And I thought, well, maybe if he comes on and talks about outsourced services in the context of an acquisition, it could be a great episode for our audience.
Yeah.
Where they can learn about those early phases of ownership using outsourced services to maybe flip some switches without really disrupting your team.
Well, cool. Well, let's see. We'll get into the interview, and then on the outro, let's talk about your plans and if you've actually dabbled with any of this, and go from there. Sound good?
Sounds like a plan.
Okay, here we are with Dr. Scott Leune.
All right, everyone. I have with me here today Dr. Scott Leune from Breakaway Practice. And for those of you who don't know Scott, I'm going to briefly run through his story. But, for the most part, I think by now most people in our audience have probably heard of Scott Leune. So Scott had a startup that he started in San Antonio very quickly out of school. He ended up having 3 practices in San Antonio that he sold to Heartland Dental. And then Scott started Breakaway Practice sometime in that area. And, in the process, he owned practices in Dallas and has sold those since. But really what I want to talk to him today is about what he does with Breakaway and Dental Whale in terms of dental support services to offices. And I think in the context of what we talk about on the show with acquisitions, I think he maybe has a unique perspective that I really want to talk to him about. So how are you doing today, Scott?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
And so, Scott, I wanted you to quickly describe, your support services and outsourcing services that you guys offer at Dental Whale, and tell us a little bit about Dental Whale itself.
Yeah, well, these services did not get created because, we tried to build a service business. What happened was when I was owning 7 offices in Dallas, I was having a really hard time managing them, and I had to build things. I had to build a small call center and a small insurance center, and I had to kind of solve some IT problems, and I also figured out how to do marketing a lot differently. And those things that I built for my own practices over time grew, and over time eventually started supporting private dentists. And so today, when we look at these types of services, we are connected to 17,000 dentists. And we look at our company as having the vision of bringing private dentists the corporate level advantages that the big groups have. So if we look at our services or our seminars or equipment or cabinetry or all those things that we do, they all have that same theme. We are doing it at a corporate level infrastructure, and making it available to even the smallest private solo practice. So these services are call center and scheduling services and billing services, collections and insurance services, verification and EOB processing, marketing, IT, demographics, equipment, supplies. Just a whole slew of things, consulting, architecture services. There's just a long list of things we do. And we do them with the goal of the private dentist rising up to the same level of the corporate groups. Some of these services are really, really big. bigger than the jumbo DSOs. And some of the services are not really big yet, but they're growing a lot. For example, our architecture and design services will probably do 40 or 50 startup practices this year. Now, as a dentist and a practice owner, I use these services for a couple different reasons. Number one is I want my practices to grow. So, for example, the average practice that connects to our scheduling center grows 24% in 2 months. That's the average. Some of these services are not necessarily meant to grow. I use some of them to save money. For example, we've got a network. We've negotiated to have low pricing on equipment and supplies. And it's some of the very lowest pricing in the country. So instead of spending $116,000 on a cone beam x-ray unit, we buy the same exact one for $64,000. Or instead of spending $110 on a Bruxer crown, we spend $35. And so some of these services are meant to give a private dentist the kind of buying power and the cost savings that only the corporate groups get. And then lastly, some of the services I use because I don't know how I would manage a bunch of practices, or I don't know how I would buy a practice and improve it if I didn't have kind of predictable, buttoned up, organized services like this. So it's almost like a mandatory thing. For me to do well, I operate in this manner. So I have, a billing and insurance team that is constantly fighting unpaid claims and resubmitting them. And it's easier for me to rely on that team than it is to rely on any sort of individual inside of one of the dental practices we might acquire. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I'm a big outsourcing fan. I've always really seen a lot of the benefits. I think from a management perspective too, just the ability to offload functions and know that they're being done at a high level. The criticism or the critique I always hear is that it's way more expensive outsourcing than it is hiring a team member to do that same thing. So what would be your response to somebody who would say that?
Well, they're right in that it used to be that way. But with technology and scale, the prices have really been going down. So for example, I open a startup practice and I might have the phones covered 95 hours a week in a startup, and it might only cost me $800 a month. And that enables me to hire one person less. So, to have phones answered in a startup 95 hours a week with a really high conversion rate, by the way, I can get a lot more new patients, and I can't reproduce that if I hire someone. And not only that person, if I did hire someone, they're much more expensive than that. Now, some things are relatively expensive. For example, if you want insurance verification done, that's not just verifying, but also all the data entry, that is costly. I'm not saying it's too expensive, but to get it done right and to have someone spend a lot of time creating new employer groups and adding the coverage tables in and the downgrades and talking to an insurance company is costly. However, there's also smart ways to save money around that. So let's say you just want a company to be on hold forever and get all the verification done, but then your team is going to input the data. Well, that's very affordable. So, I say it's variable. It depends on how you structure outsourcing. There's smart ways to structure it, and then there's ways that maybe aren't as smart. And then it's also, you got to look at the ROI. So is it expensive to spend $800 to get 20 extra new patients? I'd say absolutely not. That's not expensive. And then just another example, let's say a dental office gets a ton of existing patient phone calls and they get a small amount of new patient phone calls. They could use outsourcing on just the new patients, where you get the most bang for your buck, so that all those new patient calls are handled, they're answered, and they're converted at a high rate. Yet they could send all the existing calls to their own practice, to their own team. And so the outsourcing bill for that would be really low, yet you'd get a lot of value. So I think that making a statement outsourcing's expensive is it's not really an accurate statement. It's like making a statement saying dentistry is expensive. Well, shoot, it depends, right? And it depends on how you measure expensive. Is getting a tooth fixed expensive compared to letting it fail and having to have an implant? I don't know. So that's my answer, I guess. That's a long-winded answer. It just depends.
I totally agree. And I like, the critical thinking that's involved in this, where it's not just as simple as everyone should outsource XYZ and not ABC. And so I wanted to run you through an exercise. And one of my favorite things is acquisitions and kind of walking in and, assessing where you're at and what you do first and second and third or whatever it may be. I like that topic that interests me a lot. And I think you're kind of more maybe well known as a startup guy and, having done and helped out in hundreds of startups around the country. And so what I wanted to do is maybe put you in the shoes of somebody who just bought a practice. So Scott Leune, you just bought a practice and you walk in and you have this new office and you need to determine, what changes you're going to make in what order, how you're going to use outsourcing to maybe help you make those changes a bit faster and maybe easier for your staff. So what kind of metrics would you look at to determine what you would do in what order?
Well, first, let me correct something you said. So yes, me personally, I'm known as a startup guy, and we have helped hundreds of startups. But within our company, over the last 3 years, we've helped dentists acquire over 120 practices.
Wow, I did not know that.
Yeah, we've got 12 steps on exactly how we analyze practices, and if those practices don't meet those 12 requirements, we don't buy them, or we don't recommend someone buy them. And we found that 7 out of 8 practices we would not feel comfortable purchasing. That's a big part of our organization is helping dentists buy practices. So, and it's really odd you asked me this question today because just 2 days ago we had a full day-long seminar on how to buy practices. So I do have some knowledge on it, and so I can definitely answer your question now.
Do you mind, before you do you have those 12 steps that you kind of keep in mind, or are they not on the top of your mind?
Well, it takes an entire day to teach them, to be honest with you.
Gotcha.
It's not a simple thing. It's very complex. Buying a business and understanding the ins and outs of it and the risks of it and trying to determine if it's good or not is not simple. It's very complicated if you do it right. It doesn't mean it's hard. It's just got a lot of things, a lot of pieces we got to look at and measure. So that's why it takes us a day to teach 12 things, because each thing is quite complex,
Sure.
But now to your question. So when we look at a practice, we first scan. We are really looking at. Let me kind of make it a little simple. Let's look at 3 main buckets of things. Let's look at the profit and loss statements. Let's look at the operational metrics, and let's look at the people. Okay, so profit and loss statements tell us, of course, what our expenses and our revenue looks like. And there are ratios and there are percentages that are industry standard or best practices. And we can quickly see if something looks a little out of whack. And sometimes something can look a little out of whack, like staffing. It can look too high because we have too many people or because they're overpaid. Or it can look too high because we are under collecting or underperforming for those people. And so outsourcing on the profit and loss statement, just as everyone knows, the cost of outsourcing phones, billing, and insurance, that should fall in the staffing category. So if you want your staffing cost to be 28% of your collections, for example, then outsourcing is part of that 28% calculation. And because outsourcing is more affordable when used properly compared to hiring people in practice, we typically see a cost savings or a cost reduction when we implement outsourcing. So keep that in the back of your mind. But also on the P&L, we're not just, of course, looking at people. A big, easy thing to fix is labs and supplies, those costs. We want supply costs at 4% or less, and we want lab costs at 6% or less. And the two should add up to no more than 10%. Now, it's easy for me to say 4%. I hope the listeners know that a typical practice has double that. They think it's lower, but when we actually look at the P&Ls, it's around 8%. So we implement the Dental Well Savings Network, that kind of network of dentists who have leveraged each other to have lower pricing. We implement that, and that helps us lower the costs. We also have a very specific method of managing inventory and organizing dental supplies on shelving and in tip-out bins, and that helps lower the cost as well. That's a profit and loss statement. When we look at the operational metrics, we're using a software called Dental Intel, and we are scanning the practices. Even before we purchase them, we're scanning the practices. And Dental Intel helps kind of like take an x-ray of the practice from a business angle. So we can see incipient business decay, or we can see blowout decay from the business side of the practice. And so we scan it with Dental Intel, and we might look at the reappointment rate, for example. We want that to be 95%. We're hoping it's a lot lower when we scan this practice we're acquiring. We want the case acceptance percentage from Dental Intel to be 65%, and we're hoping the practice has it much lower. We are wanting the diagnosis to be 4 times our goal. We are wanting, we look at all kinds of things. We look at AR days, how long it takes to collect money. We want that. Our average is in the low 30s, and the national average is 61 AR days, which means we're really good at collecting compared to the average practice. So we're looking at those operational metrics. And between the profit and loss statement and the operational metrics, we start creating a list of things we would like to improve. And then we also look at the people bucket, and we're trying to assess, do we have rock stars on the team that have just been held back? Or do we have maybe people that don't fit anymore into our model, right? Maybe the people that are there are there because they've been there forever, but they're not actually there because they do good work. And so from looking at the people, we also try to create any sort of maybe desired changes. Once we go through that process of the P&Ls, the operational metrics, and the people, we now have a list of changes we'd like to see in this practice. And so now we have to figure out, well, what comes first? And so we are going to pick the changes that bring us the lowest disruption, highest return first. And then we're going to rank them that way. Low disruption, high return first. And then the last thing would be the opposite of that. High disruption, low return. Outsourcing is typically one of the first things we do because we can do it in a way that's low disruption, high return. For example, practices on average miss 38% of their phone calls. So one thing that we can do that's very low disruption, high return is we can send all the missed calls, we can outsource that so that someone saves those calls. It doesn't disrupt what people are doing in the practice. We're just outsourcing all the things they drop, and we're saving those. We can also outsource fighting all the unpaid claims. It's not necessarily changing what this newly acquired team is doing. It's saving everything they dropped. And I tell you, actually, when you buy a practice, that's where a ton of value is in cleaning up the accounts receivables. It's crazy what we find in those practices on a regular basis, and it's easy to clean up.
So how would you know, looking at a practice, that you needed to clean up unpaid claims?
Well, every practice has unpaid claims that need to be cleaned up. So really, it's not, do we think there are any there or not? We've never found a practice that did not have problems with unpaid claims. The question in our mind is, how much work is it going to take? And for that, we can easily put a number to that. We scan it with Dental Intel, and we look at days of sales outstanding, or AR days. And the higher that number, the more work there is to be done. We also scan all the write-offs and the adjustments, and we commonly find that the team has been writing off unpaid claims that should have been fought. And so a great example is a practice that was recently acquired by one of our dentists, had over $500,000 in bad debt. We looked at that $500,000, and when that dentist acquired the practice, he paid nothing for that bad debt. Okay, so he didn't have to pay extra for that AR. It was so bad that it was worthless. Well, when we looked at the AR, about 350,000 of it was too old to collect. It was past the statute of limitation for insurance. We could not resubmit those claims. And about 150 grand of it, we fought and we collected for that dentist. It took us about 3 months, but we collected 150 grand for that dentist, which was huge because he just acquired this practice, and within 3 months, we found 150 grand of cash for this owner now. And, you know, when you look at, well, how does a practice get $500,000 of bad debt from insurance? It's because the team members were just writing it off. What happened was they weren't fighting any of the claims. They hired a new insurance coordinator some point down the road, and she didn't know the dentist NPI number, so she was entering 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 as the NPI number on all the claims, and she was just writing them off when they weren't getting paid. I mean, all kinds of crazy stuff like that happened.
Wow, that is pretty ridiculous.
Yeah, and especially with practices that have paper claims, it's a lot of work to resubmit them. That even claims that were submitted properly on paper, when they come back unpaid, the team a lot of times is just writing stuff off. Or you'll find that the team is resubmitting it, but they're not tracking that they resubmitted it. And insurance companies are really good at never receiving or losing the resubmissions. You see, so if you don't track that you resubmitted it, you'll never follow up because you'll never get anything back from the insurance company that it was or wasn't paid because they'll lose a chunk of them. So it's a little complicated. But see, outsourcing plays these games all day long. They track everything. They know all this stuff. So when you plug a newly acquired practice into an outsourcing company, you are getting a predictable level of performance. It's probably going to be better performance than the team in the practice because there's more checks and balances, and the team of the practice is so busy doing 20 things at once that you're probably going to get better performance from outsourcing. Every now and then, though, you don't. Every now and then, the team in the practice are a bunch of rock stars, and they are better than an outsourcing firm. However, for me, what I want is a predictable A- or B+. What I don't want is to have to manage a bunch of people and a bunch of practices, and sometimes I get an A+ and sometimes I get an F, because that feels like a roller coaster. That feels very stressful to run a practice that way. And in that roller coaster, that's how we just quit looking at things and we get write-offs and adjustments and embezzlement and all kinds of other things. So I value predictability, even if it's not an A+. I would rather have a constant A- or B+ than an occasional home run and an occasional strikeout.
I love Q-Optics loops to the point where I reached out to them and asked them if they wanted to sponsor season 1 of my podcast. The first time I put on their loops, I thought to myself, why can't everyone do this? Why can't everyone nail my angle of declination that I want? And the only reservation I had about Q-Optics was that their magnification couldn't go high enough for what I wanted. Well, I am proud to announce that Q-Optics now offers an expanded line of their prismatic loops. So you can go all the way from 2.5 to 3 to 3.5, 4, all the way up to 4.5 in their same frame that everyone loves. This is awesome because every other loops company that I've used in the past has always said, oh, well, yeah, we can do 4 or 4.5, but not in that frame. We have to go up to this other frame that isn't as ergonomic, and we can't push the angle of declination. And after 3 weeks of using it, my neck's hurting. I'm like, what's the point of using loops if my neck hurts? And I love more magnification. I love being able to see that big cartoon tooth at 4.5x and just know that my margin is money because I can feel and see it. Oh, and did I mention they're through the lens? This is no flip down, flip up, whatever you want to call it. These bad boys aren't going anywhere. If you are ready to upgrade both your magnification and your ergonomics, you can email sales@q-optics.com with the promo code SP16 for $100 off of the loops alone or $300 off a loop and light combo. for our podcast listeners only. That's SP, as in shared practices 16, to sales@qoptics.com.
And Scott, on that same topic of, or I guess things that you can outsource that are high ROI, low, disruption. You have phones, unpaid claims. What are your other things that you would go to initially?
Well, I mean, the very first thing I would do is get on the like something like what we have, the Dental Well Savings Network, where you are now part of a kind of a tribe of dentists that are all negotiating. We're negotiating on their behalf so that they are paying a lot less money for things. That's the very first thing I would do, because immediately you save tens of thousands of dollars a year. And then on the operational side of outsourcing, I think the phone, specifically either the calls you miss or new patient calls, that is low disruption, high ROI. Also, managing claims, we talked about, that's low disruption, high ROI. When you look at equipment repair, one of our companies, Dental Fix, you can pay that company just a few $100 a month and you'll have unlimited repair service. And that's typically way cheaper than hiring some of these big distributors. So some of these, and that's not disruption. And so you'll make money without, disrupting the operations of the practice. I mean, there's also on the marketing side, you could think, okay, well, marketing does not necessarily disrupt the practice. So if you could either save money, or if you could do new things that work well, that's typically non-disruptive. And so outsourcing some of the marketing things can be very important. Like, for example, if you do direct mail right now, most people in our profession that sell us stuff, they tell us direct mail doesn't work as well. For us and the way we do direct mail, it works extremely well. So if you're doing direct mail and you feel like it's not working as well, low disruption would be to change how you're doing it, and to drive up the ROI, or of course quit doing it if it's not working well. So, I'm sorry, it's kind of a weird answer to your question, but there's so many things that practices outsource, and a whole lot of them are low disruption.
So I have a question for you. Phones, I think when I left Breakaway, I think most people would leave Breakaway feeling like phones are just, the heartbeat of the practice and one of the most important things. And I mean, would you agree with that kind of premise and statement?
Yes and no. So when we look at a practice and growing a practice, we have 3 pillars that we try to build up to grow the practice: patient flow, diagnosis, and case acceptance. Phones is a direct driver of patient flow. So it is extremely important. It's not the only important thing, but it's extremely important. But you have to kind of look at phones and really categorize the call. Because really what I'm talking about are scheduling calls, not billing and insurance questions or, other phone calls we might get from existing patients. So when we look at patients that are calling to schedule, that is extremely important to the practice. And it's one of the things that drives the 3 pillars of growth.
So for an existing practice that relies, I don't want to say more heavily on existing patients than it does on new patients, is the phone coverage equally as important as it would be for a practice that maybe is younger and needs maybe more new patients to sustain its revenue?
I would say that new patient flow is vital to a startup practice because it's the only patients they have.
Yeah.
So an existing practice has an existing patient base that is also providing dentistry and production, right, for the practice, which helps make the new patient flow not as vital. However, existing patient flow, those are the best patients. They have the highest case acceptance, the lowest no-show rates. Phones does influence them in a big way. What we see, two things, well, a couple things. So first, we know that existing patients call to cancel. And there is a number that you can measure that tells you how good or bad you are at handling the existing patient cancellation. It's what we call the cancellation conversion rate. And we know last month, for example, our conversion rate was in the 60s, 60 percentile, in the 60s. which meant that 65% of the time an existing patient called to cancel, we prevented the cancellation. That is tremendously important to an existing practice. And so phones on cancellation calls is a very important driver of patient flow. We also know that outbound calls are very important for existing patients, specifically 3 types of outbound calls. The first one is the confirmation call. The second one is filling the hygiene schedule from overdue recall patients. And then the third one is the outbound follow-up calls when patients don't schedule treatment. Those outbound calls also drive growth in a practice from the existing patient base. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I don't know, do you guys offer all 3 of those types of calls?
To practices that just hire one of our companies as a service, we offer 2 of those calls. We fill the hygiene schedule and we confirm the appointments. The only practices that we fill the doctor's schedule with treatment for are practices that have joined one of our programs or have partnered with us.
Is there a particular reason? Are those like more difficult to train for those unscheduled treatment calls?
For sure, they're more difficult to train for because the person handling that call has to know a lot about clinical dentistry. They have to know a lot about insurance. They have to know what the practice's payment policies are. They have to be able to collect money over the phone. They have to be someone that understands 360 everything that goes on in the practice. And so that is much more difficult to handle. And as a company that is providing services to thousands of dentists, you can imagine every practice is different. And to do that kind of call well, we have to have everything customized for every single practice. And so we have not rolled that out yet to practices outside of our own internal group. We will, but we're not there yet. So we're not going to do it yet.
So what kind of conversion would you get on a call like that?
Oh, it varies dramatically between practices. Some practices, for example, have very easy payment policies and others have very difficult payment policies. Some practices have dentists that are really liked or that are really good communicators, and other practices don't. Some practices, the unscheduled treatment are $10,000 cases, and other practices, they're $500 cases. So it all varies dramatically. Insurance coverage makes it change as well. Even the age of the patient makes it change. We know that children, we get a higher rate of scheduling when it's treatment for children than when it's treatment for adults. So unfortunately, I can't give you a go-to number, but hopefully there's value in understanding that there's a lot of dynamics here that affect that specific call.
Oh yeah, completely. And so, going into a practice now, we've talked about our patient flow. So diagnosis and case acceptance. From an outsourcing perspective, what can be done to maybe help that? Or is there much that can be done outsourcing-wise?
Well, for diagnosis, you can't outsource diagnosis, but what you can do is receive training and buy the right tools and learn the right systems. So for our practices where we would like to diagnose more dentistry, well, let me first off make sure we're clear here. What I'm talking about is diagnosing the dentistry people need, not the dentistry people don't need. So when I talk about diagnosing more dentistry, I'm saying let's learn some new procedures so we can diagnose more types of procedures. Or let's learn to be more disciplined in our diagnosis. Let's not just diagnose fluoride, for example, because insurance pays for it. Let's diagnose that type of stuff when it's needed, regardless of insurance coverage, right? So learning more procedures and being more disciplined is how we diagnose more. And the way that we help dentists that are connected to us do that is we've got a series of clinical courses that are actually really cool. For example, we have an 18-month continuum course that teaches dentists how to do short-term cosmetic and comprehensive braces. We've also got a 6-course series over 18 months that is a combination of business and clinical training so that dentists can improve their diagnosis and their productivity. So they'll learn how to take clinical images, they'll learn new techniques for cosmetic dentistry, and they'll learn communication and case acceptance all in one 2-day session. And then the next time they come, they'll learn how to take out wisdom teeth, they'll learn about bone grafting and suturing, and they'll learn about insurance coverages and how to maximize their payment rates, for example. So that's the type of stuff that we do. We also do it in hygiene as well. 3 different levels of hygiene training that we provide: preventative, perio, and case acceptance training for the hygiene team. So that's how we approach diagnosis. It's let's learn more procedures and let's get more disciplined in our system of diagnosing. You also mentioned case acceptance. Case acceptance also has mostly to do with what's going on in the practice, not what's going on from an outsourcing perspective. The things that affect case acceptance are what your payment options are, how you present them, like what does the sheet of paper actually look like? What does the doctor say in the operatory? That's super important. Also, we know that presenting finances in the operatory gets higher case acceptance than presenting finances in the front office area. We use tools to help with case acceptance, such as the SoPro camera that helps not only show a picture of the tooth, but highlight where the decay is. So, we also utilize different kind of systems with our hygienists, where our hygienists assist us in communicating with patients. So there's just a lot that goes on that influences case acceptance. Of course, also, how far out do you have to book them? The farther out you book them, they might say yes to the treatment, but they may not even show up for it. Payment policies, not just making payment easy for patients, but also if you have payment policies that require patients to pay on the day you prep, then some patients don't show up for the prep. So there's all those things that we take into account, and of course we teach all this stuff in all of our seminars, but there's just a lot that goes into maximizing case acceptance.
So one thing you talked about, and you talked about a lot of stuff, so no time to go into everything, but you talked about presenting treatment inside of the operatory. From a staffing perspective, sometimes that can be challenging for me, is to have a team member available to go in. Now, is there a dollar amount that you recommend, cases above X, you do it, or do you do it for every case?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question because you're assuming that it takes a certain amount of time to present finances, and you may not have time for your team to do that all the time. And so you're trying to solve the problem by saying, well, let me just do it on the bigger cases. That's what, in essence, kind of what you're implying here.
Correct.
Well, I'm going to challenge your assumption because I'll tell you that presenting finances should only take 2 or 3 minutes. And if it only takes 2 or 3 minutes, you can do it just about every time. The reason why it's a challenge maybe for you or for other practices is because it's not taking 2 or 3 minutes. So now let's rewind from there. Well, why is it not taking you 2 or 3 minutes? Probably because of what you're printing. You're probably printing the treatment plan form out of Dentrix or Open Dental or EagleSoft. And that treatment plan form itemizes everything. It shows every single little dollar amount for every procedure, including insurance coverage. And if you were to count how many numbers are on that sheet of paper, it might be, I'm not kidding, I'm not over-exaggerating, it might be 60, 70 different numbers. And when you print that out, suddenly the conversation takes 15 minutes. And you've got to have an insurance and billing guru explain everything that's on that sheet of paper. So I believe that the problem, the bottleneck for you is the sheet of paper, not that your people don't have time.
Well, I appreciate that. I will look into that, Scott. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
So now, in our kind of premise of the episode, you've walked into the practice, and we've outsourced some basic services, phones, unpaid claims, a savings network. We've got hooked up to that, some equipment repair and some marketing. And we've looked at, our patient flow. We've worked on our diagnosis and case acceptance. So, as a new owner, is there anything else that you would potentially add or change to, what we've talked about so far?
Well, I've got a very unpopular set of opinions. And for my whole career, to be honest with you, I feel like what I say is unpopular. And so I'm going to give you some unpopular opinions right now.
Sure.
I believe that the best practices to acquire are practices that are large, stable, with a high profit margin. And in those situations, I am wanting to take this beautiful practice and polish it up. I don't want to disrupt it. I don't want to create massive change. Even if I know that I might be able to do something better, I still don't want to take the risk because it's already polished and it's already beautiful. Those are the practices I want to buy. Well, there's not a lot of those practices available. 7 out of 8 are not those practices. So if I'm buying a practice that is not beautiful, I don't want to polish up a turd. Okay? I'm going to have to disrupt and reinvent. If it does not have a high margin, if it's not super successful, then I've got to fix this thing up. And so I am not scared to change the team, for example. I'm not scared to rename the practice. I'm not scared to buy new furniture and to have a new website and to paint the walls. A lot of people tell young dentists the opposite of what I just said. A lot of people tell younger dentists, buy a modest-sized practice. Keep the team on board for a while, work in it for 6 months, learn how everything's going, and then start gently changing things. To me, that is horrible advice. Number one, don't buy a modest practice, buy a profitable practice. Number two, if you are going to buy a modest practice, don't own that thing for 6 months without making money. You got to change it. You can't take on the risk of a dud of a practice. So don't be scared to change. The practices that are not successful operate a certain way. And the team that they have is that certain team, and that's the right team for that unsuccessful practice. But if you want a different kind of practice, if you want to raise that practice up to a higher level of success, it means you have to change it. Like, if you don't change it, it doesn't make more money. It stays the same. You have to change it. And sometimes the way you present finances or the way you answer phones is not the way you should for the bigger practice. Or the team members you have aren't the right people for that bigger practice, for that better practice. So I think on the premise of this episode, I initially said, hey, let's do the lowest disruption, highest ROI stuff first. And that's correct, especially if we're talking about a beautiful, profitable practice that we're just trying to polish a little bit without scratching it up. But if we're talking about a practice that is not very successful, and for whatever reason we still bought it, that practice needs to be fixed up. We need to fix up that house. And that means we're going to have to move some walls and do some painting and change some people. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I guess my follow-up to that would be, what does I know you said high profit margin for the beautiful practice, but more specifically, what kind of metrics, what are you looking at to maybe categorize it as a beautiful practice statistically?
That's a great question. So we look at practices a little differently than a dentist looks at a practice, even though I'm a dentist. But dentists typically talk to each other about their overhead percentages and their take-home pay. And they'll say something like, I have 60% overhead, which means I have 40% take-home pay. Well, that is what people say when they're talking about jobs they own. Because trust me, the profit margin on that business is not 40%. It only looks like 40% because they're not paying themselves yet. If I had to pay a dentist to operate in that practice, and I had to pay all the other bills, how much money would be left over? That's the profitability of the practice. So after I pay all the dentists, that number, I'd like to see that number at 18%. And I'd like to see all my costs associated with paying a dentist at 20% of total office collections, which means in dentist speak, I'd like to have at least 38% take-home pay. So about 60% overhead or less.
So then what hygiene percentage would that leave you with? I'm trying to do the math in my head.
Yeah, hygiene is typically about 1/4 year production.
So you want to see it around 25%?
Well, no, that's what's typical. But yes, let's just say yes. I mean, there's all kinds of things that come into play, but yes, that's typical. But understand that that's just one metric. So let's just say 60% overhead. That's one metric. But here's the other thing. I still got to live, right? So if I have 60% overhead of a tiny little practice, I'm still not taking home much money. I've got to be able to pay all of my loan payments and pay all of my own personal expenses and have enough money left over to also pay all the taxes and also have a cushion. And hopefully I'm improving my lifestyle. So when I buy a really big practice that has a good margin, even if it shrinks after I buy it, I can still make a lot of money. But if I buy a tiny little practice, even if it has a good profit margin, if it shrinks just a little bit, I could be screwed. So why do you think Heartland won't buy a practice unless it typically does at least $800,000 in collections a year, right? Because the smaller you get in practice, the much higher the risk is. I'd rather pay $1 million for a larger practice than $300,000 for a small practice. Paying $300,000 for a small practice is way too risky. Am I making sense?
Perfect sense. Yes. In past episodes, we've mentioned the importance of laying out the flow of your next or first dental practice before moving on to the floor plan. The conceptual layout is key to make sure you get the most from your dental space. But we are not all in the same phase of this process. You may not be looking for a new practice or trying to figure out how to design the most efficient new office possible, and we get that. In reality, many of you may already have a practice and are just trying to figure out how to make that office better today. And part of the beauty of having Design Ergonomics as a sponsor for this podcast is that they have a range. Design Ergonomics emphasizes how they design, equip, and train the best and most productive dental practices in America. It's the final of that 3 steps offering that I want to hear you today. Train. This past year, Design Ergonomics launched their Reboot training, specifically the 2-day dental reboot. The team at Design Ergonomics will send an expert clinical trainer to your practice to physically set up the support systems you need to get your practice headed in the right direction. From how you manage inventory, resupply, and deployment systems to a material assessment and a team training, their experts will do it all over the course of a 2-day hands-on workshop. I have a testimonial here from Dr. John Fornetti.
The very best part of this training was the fact that when they leave, you are set up. So everything is done. So on Monday, you're actually implementing what we learned to do.
And it comes with a guarantee. If you don't see a 20% increase in your practice's productivity in the first 4 months after your training, they will refund your money. This is an incredible opportunity for our listeners because today we are also giving you a special offer. Use the promo code SHAREDTRAINING on the dentalreboot.com contact us page and receive a 20% discount on your first reboot training for a limited time. That's right, 20% off your 2-day dental reboot. Again, visit their website www.dentalreboot.com and learn more about Design Ergonomics practice productivity solutions today. Again, that is www.dentalreboot.com. I'll leave a link in the show notes. So I guess my question for you would be, now what if the dentist, I know you're basing it off of, profit margin, whether or not you make changes or not, but should it also be based on the dentist's goals themselves? I mean, if they want to grow a practice a certain amount, shouldn't that kind of dictate too, their strategy in the transition?
Well, of course, but let's just say it starts with let's define what success is in this for this dentist. A pet peeve of mine is when dentists think they just need to keep growing. I mean, a great example is I was talking to one of our seminar attendees. He's been to all of our seminars, and I saw him at a convention, and he's taking home $1.2 million in profit for himself. He's got this mega practice with multiple dentists. And he was complaining to me because his wife's upset because of how much he works. And he doesn't get to go to all of his kids' soccer games. And then he said, but he's thinking about building 2 more practices. And I'm thinking, what in the world are you, how are you thinking this? Like, let's first define why we're even a dentist, why we're even working in a practice. Like, the money's supposed to pay for something else. It's not just about building bigger and more money. So how much does that dentist need? They don't need more than 1.2 million, I can guarantee it. So I had this kind of come to Jesus talk with this dentist, and he decided to cut back 2 days a week, not build more practices, and he expected his income to go down to 800 grand a year take home pay. But geez, he'd be able to have the life he wanted. All right. So we all need to have a goal. Like, dentistry is meant as a vehicle to provide us freedom of choice in the rest of our life. Freedom of choice to be healthy, to be happy, to be giving. So buying a practice, I say, let's look deep down inside and say, how much money do we need so that we can not constantly work, but instead choose to have the things we want in life? Let's start with that number. And now let's work our way backwards into the practice to say, what do we need to grow this practice to in order to achieve the balance we desire?
I love that. I think that's a great perspective. And I honestly think that's a great way to kind of wrap up our discussion. Did you have anything else you wanted to add to this discussion before we concluded?
Look, dentistry is extremely complicated and simple at the same time. So, the issue is there's too much noise. There's too much noise in the day. And that noise of issues prevents an owner from focusing on the few things in a simple way that really do matter. We just get caught up in the noise, and we can never actually look and focus and address the important things. Same thing in our life. There's a lot of noise in our life. Why the heck do we listen to the noise instead of just having a better life? And same thing in our profession. Oh my God, there's a lot of noise. Everyone's now a Facebook expert. Everyone tells you what to do. And really, it's just important to focus, not to listen to all the noise. If anyone wants to understand how we focus, how we look at a startup or an acquisition or an existing practice, sure, I'd love it if people hired our companies or learn more about our companies. That'd be great. But to be honest with you, the easiest, quickest way to understand our method and to understand if you should even hire us for stuff is to just go to one of our seminars. It'll probably be the 2 most valuable days of CE you've ever had, and you'll love it. And after that, you'll know how to run your practice, and you'll be in a much better position to understand if you need help or not. If you want to know anything about those seminars, you can go to either 2 websites, breakawaypractice.com, breakawaypractice.com, that tells you about our seminars. Or if you just want to learn about our company and how we help 17,000 dentists, you can go to dentalwhale.com. But please, learn good information, stay focused on what matters, and don't get sucked into the noise. That's my last bit of words here. I hope it's okay.
No, I love that. And, I'll vouch for the seminars as well. I went to Breakaway, the Business Masters, and the Startup course about 3 years ago. And it really changed the way I look at things, entirely. I don't think it would be an understatement to say it changed my life. And then I recently acquired a practice, and I sent my 2 front office to the office manager mastery that you have. And I really think that has reinvigorated them to maybe understand things and see them the way that I do. And so it really helped us get on the same page. And so I could really vouch for those 3 seminars that you offer.
Awesome. I appreciate those words. So please let me know if you ever need any help, if we should do another podcast on something specific, or if anyone here has any questions. Our company, we are an open book. So just let us know if you ever need anything.
Okay, that was another phenomenal episode. I love having Dr. Leune back on. Every single time, it's just like pure gold, pure knowledge transfer, all of his data, all of his information. He's so authoritative about it too. Like he's just like, no, here's what the data says. You can't argue with this. We know. We've done this over and over and over and over and over.
No, I found that, he has so much information. I find myself at times being envious of all of the data he has at his fingertips.
Yeah.
Where he just has answers to these questions that we ask.
Yeah.
Like they're nothing. So I think that's, pretty awesome that he's able to do that. But also informative to our audience. I think there's a lot of takeaways here.
I think that one of the great moments in that interview was when you're like, well, do you mind sharing with us the 12 steps? And he's like, well, it's a pretty complex process of acquisitions. And like, we're both just like chomping at the bit, like, but we know, we get it. We're there with you. We can hang with you, like start spouting off some stuff. But I think, that's obviously another episode or 5, of his version of acquisitions, since they have a whole course built around it. So I understand that it would sidetrack the entire episode, but I'm okay with sidetracks.
Yeah, I threw out the question, and I understand it's a long answer.
Yeah.
And I think our audience also understands that. I think one of the takeaways from this episode, maybe unrelated to anything like content wise, is how far our audience has come. Assuming they've listened to all the episodes, where some things that Scott's explaining, I think in his mind he's thinking there's no way anybody would understand this, and our audience is like, yep, got it.
Yep.
Ready to move on.
Totally. Yeah, no, and I still like, I'm super interested because they've got a very specific process. I'd love to hear their version of that process, but we absolutely can hang and follow. And I love that we've armed our audience with that information. So
yeah, I don't think it's, I think it's relatively similar to what we've talked about, to be totally honest with you.
Yeah.
Based on everything he said, it was very, kind of matching up with season 2.
No, totally. So in terms of outsourcing, what were your takeaways for your practice? Like, what have you done and what are you thinking about doing? Where are you at with that?
Yeah. So I think, Scott's whole notion of low disruption, high ROI is something that I've always tried to, as a new practice owner, always trying to keep in the forefront of my mind.
Yeah.
So I think the couple things that I took away, especially unpaid claims, as being a big opportunity. So after I listened to the episode, I was writing down, certain things, and I went to the office and I talked to my office manager, who does a lot of our billing and insurance coordination. And, I was talking to her about unpaid claims, and I got the idea from her that, there aren't very many in our practice, and, there weren't like ones that we could really follow up with. But I think the fact that she had an answer to that question gave me the confidence that, for us, that wasn't going to be something that, might be very fruitful.
That's
but
high
I think
yield. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I inquired, so we're using an outsourcing company. And so I inquired with that company, what would it take for us to do our unpaid claims? And they had told me that they'd have to go back and audit all of our like adjustments and see, why things are being adjusted. And so just based on the way that we were doing things, it just didn't make a whole lot of sense. It was a lot of, hours of their time for probably not that much of unpaid claim reimbursement. So
do you know,
go ahead.
Do you know what your AR days were, when like the average AR days for a claim when you got to your office?
Yeah. So I have practice by numbers. So I have those metrics. We were like under 30 pre-acquisition.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
So yeah, we're really on top of that part of it. But we acquired the practice, and I sent my front desk to Breakaway, and there were a couple of holidays here and there. So we kind of fell behind, and we peaked out at 34. Okay. And now I think we're back down to under 30. Okay. So there was a period there we fell behind, but I knew why we were behind, and it wasn't something that concerned me.
Well, and he said that a lot of the practices they're acquiring are up in the 60s. So
yeah,
the fact that you're ranging from right around below that range, he said that we're shooting for around 30, and that's right where you guys were. So
yeah, exactly.
So it sounds like you are outsourcing something then. What are you currently outsourcing?
So right now we are So we were outsourcing unscheduled treatment calls and overdue recalls. We were not finding a whole lot of success with the unscheduled treatment calls.
based on the amount of effort and monetary investment we were putting in, we weren't getting such a direct output. We're having a lot more success with overdue recall. So
Okay.
now we have an outsourced agency every day calling on our unscheduled recall and leaving messages on all those patients. And right now, I think like the direct tracking. So every patient that they're on the phone with that they schedule, we're right now around $20 in unscheduled recall is what our total cost is.
So that's how much it costs you per patient who comes back in through their efforts.
Correct.
Okay.
And, looking at our practice when we walked in, a huge thing that we had was a very large overdue patient base, like more than 30% of our total active patients were overdue, not even considering the patients that have gone unactive or inactive. So that was a big thing that we weren't doing. And that's why we custom, I think each acquisition is different. So being able to see what your biggest needs are.
Yeah.
And for us, I think overdue recall was kind of it's a big focus right now.
Did you find that, Scott talked about the complexity of getting patients back in with unscheduled treatment and how that's just a higher touch, higher skill call. So you kind of found that to be true with outsourcing that?
Oh yeah. And, like it will pick up on all of the inconsistencies in your charting or like your notes. And yeah, it's very difficult to get that right. And, that's what we figured out too. Sometimes one of us would treatment plan something, but tell the patient that like, we're not going to do it right now. We'll do it later. And then they would get a call about it, and so then they would get upset or wondering why, and so there are some nuances that you have to be very consistent in your charting and in your note taking and putting things where the outsourcing agency will see them.
Yeah.
So open communication, making sure that that's all fluid. So yeah, there's a lot to the unscheduled treatment calls.
Okay. So do you have any plans to outsource anything else in the future?
Yeah. So the next thing that we're looking at right now is the overflow phones. So, my staff went to Breakaway and they saw their missed call rate. And I think they've been very alarmed at how many calls we've been missing. And as we've begun to track our missed calls, we've had a decline in, the number of calls that have been missed over time. But right now we are weighing the option of, having an overflow phone service answer our missed new patient calls.
I loved the idea that he talked about where you have like a separate number for new patients, which you should be doing if you're trying to track marketing intelligently, and having those calls be the ones that are kind of prioritized by your outsourcing company, so that you're sure that you don't miss those versus calls of your existing patient base. So I thought that was pretty cool that you could kind of intelligently outsource in that way.
I also like the phone tree. Like you've reached whatever dentistry, press number 1 if you're a new patient or 2 if you're an existing patient. And then 1 gets routed, 2 goes to the office, that type of thing.
Yeah.
I think either way, that principle is very important if you're going to outsource, especially if you're going to have them on the front end versus doing the overflow, to make sure that they're not answering your existing patient phone calls.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. So no, that's really cool. And I, like you said, you and Breakaway are very much on the same page of the least disruptive positive changes. And I love how he talked about when you're looking at these acquisitions, you almost want these numbers to be low and bad because they're things that you can outsource and fix right away. So there's just kind of like it's money laying on the table that if you understand what you're looking at and you understand, okay, I plan to improve these via outsourcing this way, and you can effectively implement that system, some instant improvement that you can achieve there.
Yeah. And, and the idea that like, you're buying a cash flowing business that's doing very well in spite of these weaknesses, and then have those be weaknesses that are easily corrected, I think is kind of a really nice thing walking into an acquisition.
Cool. Well, awesome. That was another fantastic episode. I'm excited. I'm actually going to get Dr. Leune back on later on this month. We've had to push it back a few times, but I'm supposed to talk to him about startups. I'm tempted to talk to him about case acceptance. So we'll see what actually happens if I get. But he's got a thing with case acceptance now, so I think he might be willing to promote that. I'll coordinate with him, but I really want to talk to him about case acceptance because he's good. He's so good at selling. I mean, at conveying authority, teaching, and getting people on board with his vision. And I think he has to have amazing systems and be able to train docs to increase their case acceptance. That's one of the core 3 things that he talked about in the show. So we'll see if we end up doing startups or case acceptance. Either way, it'll be fantastic. Every time we have him on the show, it's awesome.
Awesome. Well, I'll see you guys. And next week will be the start of season 4, which I'm super excited about.
Yeah, this is going to be a big season. We've had some good interviews already and a lot more down the pipeline, but case acceptance is going to be big. It's going to be a ton of fun. So thank you guys for joining us on the Shared Practices podcast. We'll talk with you next week.
We're going to introduce a new segment to the show today, the metrics that matter most, brought to us by Practice by Numbers. I'm sure that everyone has heard someone say, doctors are the worst business managers. That may be the case for some dentists, but it doesn't have to be the case for you. Successful dental practices consistently monitor and seek to improve a few key metrics. Practice by Numbers dashboard analytics software provides a simple way for you to track and improve the metrics that matter the most. Today, we are looking at the percentage of perio patients. Current medical wisdom tells us that this metric is important to the health of your patients and your practice. Periodontal disease is linked to at least 8 major systemic diseases and is prevalent in about 50% of the population. For this reason, when we see a practice that only has 50 to 20% perio patients, we know that this is a great opportunity for the practice to increase revenue. This is productivity that can be added without the dentist lifting a finger. When we share with the hygienists that their percentage of patients with perio disease is unusually low, we typically find that they have been doing a lot of bloody prophies. Many times, a small investment in a good perio update is all it takes to get back on track. We like to set up a custom dashboard for hygienists so they can log in and track their progress. They can instantly see how many perio procedures they are doing and work towards properly treating and charging for perio procedures. A healthy goal in a typical dental practice would be that the percentage of perio patients is between 30 and 35%. Higher if your demographic includes many seniors, and of course lower if you have a big pediatric presence in the office. To learn more about using smart data to manage your business, visit practicebynumbers.com.